In 1848, workers in a limestone quarry in Gibraltar uncovered a strange skull. It would later be recognized as belonging to a Neanderthal, one of our closest evolutionary relatives. At the time, however, no one fully understood its significance. Only years later, after the publication of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, scientists begin to grasp what that skull represented. A glimpse into the deep evolutionary history of the human brain. That fossil hinted at something extraordinary. The human brain is not simply large. It is the product of a long evolutionary history, one that eventually gave rise to language, symbolic thought, long-term planning, and culture. But how did such a brain become possible at all? How did a primate lineage that began with relatively modest brains produce an organ so complex, so energetically demanding, and so unlike anything else in the natural world? Answering that question requires moving far back in time, long before Neanderthals, and even before the first members of our own genus. More than 3 million years ago in Africa, Australopithecines were already walking upright. In that respect, they had taken one of the decisive steps in human evolution. But in many other ways, they still remained close to other apes' conditions. Their bodies were relatively small, their arms were long, their fingers still curved, and their faces projected forward in a strongly prognatous face profile. Their jaws were robust and adapted to heavy chewing. Above all, their brains remained modest in size, usually around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, not much different from those of modern chimpanzees. The skull was low and elongated, lacking the rounded cranial vault that would later characterize more derived members of the genus Homo. Australopithecines, then, were not yet creatures with greatly expanded brains. They stood at an earlier point in this story, one in which bipedalism had already appeared. But the dramatic enlargement of the encephalon was still not a trait our ancestor relied on. A major shift began with the emergence of early species of Homo. These hominins did not suddenly develop human traits, but they did begin to alter their relationship with the environment in a fundamentally new way. Stone tools allowed them to process plant materials more efficiently and, perhaps even more importantly, to exploit animal tissues that had previously been harder to access. Meat could be cut from carcasses. Bones could be broken open to extract marrow. Foods rich in fat and calories became easier to obtain. This mattered because the brain is an extraordinarily expensive organ. It consumes a disproportionate amount of the body's energy, and any significant increase in brain size would have required a more reliable energetic foundation. A shift toward calorie-rich foods helped provide that foundation. At the same time, some researchers have argued that improvements in dietary quality may have reduced the relative energetic burden of digestion, allowing more energy to be invested in neural tissue. This idea is often discussed under the name of the expensive tissue hypothesis. Whether or not every part of that model is accepted in its strongest form, the broader point remains important. Brain expansion could not occur in isolation. It had to be supported metabolically. A more energy-rich diet, combined with increasingly effective ways of processing food, made these changes possible. Once that process began, its consequences may have become self-reinforcing. Better tools made high-value foods easier to exploit. More reliable access to such foods supported larger and more complex brains. In turn, improved cognition made tool production, planning, and food acquisition more efficient. Over long stretches of evolutionary time, this relationship between behavior, diet, and cognition may have contributed to the steady enlargement of the hominin brain. Yet food alone cannot explain the whole story. The evolution of the human brain also depended on development. Humans are born unusually helpless and undergo a prolonged period of growth compared with most other primates. This extended developmental window gives the brain more time to mature and more time to build complex neural connections. It also creates a life history in which learning becomes exceptionally important. Long childhoods are expensive, but they allow for prolonged social interaction, imitation, memory formation, and cultural transmission. In evolutionary terms, that is a profound shift. It means that a growing proportion of adaptation can occur not only through anatomy, but through information passed between generations. This is where neoteny, the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood, becomes relevant. Human beings retain a number of features that can be described as pedomorphic when compared with other apes, and the timing of our development differs markedly from theirs. In the case of the brain, prolonged growth and delayed maturation appear to have been crucial. Changes in the skull and face were also part of this broader transformation. As hominin diets changed, and as tools increasingly helped process food before it ever reached the mouth, the selective pressure for extremely large chewing muscles may have declined. Over time, the jaws became smaller and the face less projecting. Some older hypotheses tried to connect this shift quite directly to genetic factors, such as changes affecting the MYH16 gene. In non-human primates, this gene is functional and produces proteins that contribute to large, powerful jaw muscles. In the human lineage, however, a mutation that occurred around 2.4 million years ago rendered this gene inactive. As a result, humans developed much smaller jaw muscles. This reduction is linked to more neotenic traits and may have influenced skull development by reducing mechanical constraints on the cranium. With less pressure from large chewing muscles, the skull could expand more freely, potentially facilitating brain growth during development. So, as diet, food, processing, and facial mechanics changed, the architecture of the skull changed with them, and that altered framework formed part of the setting in which larger brains evolved. No single cause explains the human brain. Its evolution reflects an interaction between multiple processes unfolding together over immense spans of time. Diet, development, tool use, social life, all of them mattered during the long and complex evolutionary history of our brain. None of these acted alone, and none can easily be removed from the others. Sociality, in particular, was likely central. Living in increasingly complex groups places heavy demands on memory, communication, inference, cooperation, and conflict management. Individuals must track alliances, recognize intentions, interpret signals, and respond flexibly to changing situations. In such environments, enhanced cognition is not an abstract advantage. It becomes directly relevant to survival and reproduction. At the same time, the production and transmission of tools introduced another layer of selection. Tools are not simply objects. They are learned behaviors, materialized in stone, wood, and bone. To make, use, improve, and pass them on, a lineage needs not only manual ability, but also learning, imitation, teaching, and memory. Once technology begins to accumulate culturally, the demands on the brain become even greater. Because adaptation is no longer purely biological. It also becomes social and informational. Environmental instability likely intensified these pressures. Over the course of the Quaternary, African environments shifted repeatedly in response to climatic oscillations. Habitats changed. Resources became patchier or more seasonal. Under such conditions, rigid specialization could be risky. Flexibility became valuable. For a lineage without claws, fangs, great speed, or massive strength, cognition may have become the best and rapid adaptive resource of all. A larger and more flexible brain would have allowed our ancestors to respond to change not through a single narrow specialization, but through behavioral versatility. Over millions of years, these pressures combined to produce a nervous system of unprecedented complexity. And yet, that history should not be misunderstood. The evolution of the human brain was not a predetermined ascent toward intelligence. Evolution does not work toward fixed goals, and many species have thrived without exceptionally large brains. In our own lineage, however, a rare combination of ancestral traits, ecological pressures, developmental shifts, and historical contingencies favored the expansion of a remarkably costly organ. The result was not simply a larger primate brain. It was a brain capable of storing traditions, shaping language, imagining things that do not yet exist, and reflecting on its own origins. That is what makes the story so striking. The human brain is not an isolated miracle, nor an inevitable endpoint. It is the outcome of a long and contingent evolutionary process, one rooted in bodies that still climbed, in landscapes that demanded flexibility, and in ancestors who gradually transformed survival into greatness.